Today we are going to be talking about the New Mexico Central Railway. The New Mexico Central Railway was a project, a part of a larger project I undertook multiple years ago. But for those of you who don't know what the New Mexico Central Railway is, and here we have a ticket from the New Mexico Central Railway on display. The New Mexico Central Railway was probably more famously known in New Mexico as the Bean Line. It was the train line that connected Santa Fe pretty much down south to El Paso, Texas. But its headquarters was in the Estancia Valley, in an area known as Torrance County, in the town of Estancia. The area of the Estancia Valley, which included the town of Moriarty, where I went to junior high and high school, in the early 20th century, was the center of bean production in New Mexico, pinto bean production. In fact, the high school in Moriarty is known as the Fighting Pintos today. And while they give an image, a beautiful image of a pinto horse as being their symbol, realistically, the pintos were the name is associated with bean originally. Now, at various times, the Santa Fe or the New Mexico Central Railway was initially commissioned as the Santa Fe, Albuquerque, and Pacific Railroad in 1900. It then became known as the Santa Fe Central. And then after it merged with the Albuquerque Eastern Railway, it was known as the New Mexico Central Railway. And it ran from about 1900 to 1926, when it was all bought up by the ATSF, or Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railway. Now, I'm not going to talk about all those names over and over again. What you can take away from that is that this railway I'm going to talk to you about dates from about 1900 to about 1930, in all actuality 1926. But it's that period of about the first 25 to 30 years of the 20th century that this railway was in operation. And my interest in the railway, or my research into the railway, came as a result of a project known as the Santa Fe Railyard project. And many of you actually might remember this project. It started in the archaeological investigations. The renovations are more recent, but the archaeological work for the Santa Fe Railroad project began in 2004. And it was a big undertaking that took the dilapidated areas along the railways in downtown Santa Fe, and was going to reinvigorate them. It was going to put in new shopping complexes, new parks, some movie theaters, restaurants, a whole bunch of different things. Some of it got built, some of it didn't get built. In fact, if you go there today, you can see a lot of the renovations that occurred as a result of that project. There's three major areas that were excavated or investigated as a result of that. The first one was or four, I guess. On the map it shows us four, but I tend to think of it as three. There's the Guadalupe parcel, which is separated on the map to North and South Guadalupe, the Railyard Park, and the Baca Street areas. These areas were all investigated, and as a result, there was a lot of archaeological sites. And I know you can't see that all there. If you were to look at the area as a whole, there was approximately 31 archaeological sites discovered in the project areas. And 8 of those, the ones you see listed on this image here overview, 8 of those archaeological sites were associated with the New Mexico Central Railway. And you can see where if you look there, there's some graphics as far as where the rail runner line is. In fact, at the north end, this is actually, the rail runner was part of the development for this project that came in. Now, I said before we started that the most important thing I was going to talk about today was pinto beans. So I want to hit you with some numbers real quick. In the early 20th century, pinto beans were the 5th most important crop in New Mexico from the standpoint of acreage. Pinto beans were used in almost every portion of New Mexico cuisine. Most famously, they're used in making refried beans, but you actually get them in a lot of different products. In fact, pinto beans were the beans of choice for most Hispanic residents in New Mexico throughout our historic period, the colonial period. Roughly 150,000 acres of New Mexico land were under pinto bean production at that time. And most of that land, 120,000, or about 78% of that land, was in the Estancia Basin. And the New Mexico Central, which you can see Locomotive 9 here in 1918. The purpose of the New Mexico Central was primarily to take those agricultural products. It was built up and created so they could take those agricultural products, primarily pinto beans, and redistribute them around the state to make farmers in Moriarty and Estancia make their way of living viable. It also transported coal. It transported people. It was the primary way people from Torrance County got up to Santa Fe, got up to the capital, and vice versa. In fact, through an adjoining line, you could get all the way from Santa Fe to El Paso on the New Mexico Central. So it was a very important line as a whole. In fact, we're going to look at some maps right here and kind of see that. These are harder to envision. But if you'll notice, while these can be hard to see, both of them, if you look centrally on the maps in both locations, you'll find Moriarty as well as Estancia itself, Torrance and further points further south. One of the big accessible features in this railroad is that it was supported by local businessmen. So unlike the ATSF, which was largely funded by corporation or investors from out of state, the entire management and performance of this railway was actually associated directly with New Mexico businessmen. And so we can see in the circa 1908 map kind of what the railroad looked like at its height. You'll notice that there's several spurs coming off the railroad. One of those spurs what was started in Moriarty, and it went west towards the town of Hagen. The idea, Hagen at that time was a big coal mining community just east of San Felipe, but unfortunately it did not get all the way there. Funding broke off at a time. There was also a opportunity. If you look on that 1908 map on your left-hand side, you'll see a dotted line emerging out from Estancia that appears to go out towards the Salt Lakes. That was another spur off that line that was expected to bring salt, the salt production from the Salt Lakes and Estancia onto the railroad itself. So there was an effort to grow this line. Unfortunately, as I said, funds ran out before they got to Hagen. So while the map on 1908 shows the line going all the way out to Hagen, it doesn't actually get there. It gets to about the Sandia Mountains and then stops. And the road towards the Salt Lakes is never built. Two of the biggest supporters of this railroad, who we can actually see in these photos, and I have them listed where they're located, were Arthur Seligman and Benjamin Pankey. If you don't know those names, Arthur Seligman was a New Mexico governor. He also was Santa Fe mayor at different times in the past. He's here, fifth on the left. You can actually see he's in that grayer suit. You can also see on the right-hand side, Benjamin Pankey. He was a state senator and rancher who figured very heavily in supporting this. These are the boosters, as it were. So these are the people who you kind of paid to have the operation going. However, for all their hard work, the Santa Fe the New Mexico Central Railway, also known as the Santa Fe Central for a period of time, really couldn't get off the ground. It every time it had money coming in, it appeared it was never enough. I should put it that way from a historic perspective. And eventually the whole thing was bought up by the ATSF in 1926. Now for the work on the New Mexico, here's another picture of the New Mexico Central Railway Company in Santa Fe, New Mexico in 1923. This is the area in which I would focus on my research. So this was the area I worked in. So the northernmost stop of the New Mexico Central was in Santa Fe. From there, it actually could connect up to the Chile line, which was a narrow gauge railroad. In fact, they shared a station later in time. But the New Mexico Central, which was a standard gauge railroad, literally went right up to the edge of the Chile line. So you could move Chile from northern New Mexico onto the New Mexico Central lines and bring it to places south. Similarly, the beans from the Moriarty area, the New Mexico Central, could go onto the Chile line and get all the way up into southern Colorado. So these two lines were actually linked historically throughout the whole time period. In fact, I bet a lot of you have eaten at Tomasita's restaurant. If you went back in the day and you got on the train in Moriarty or Estancia, you would ride that train all the way to Tomasita's, and you would get off at Tomasita's, which was the station house for the New Mexico Central. It was also the station house for the Chile line. And from there, you could get on another train, a smaller one, a narrow gauge train, and go all the way up into southern Colorado on the Chile line. So, and this is the area I worked in, which was the station grounds at the far north in Santa Fe. Here we have an overview of the Santa Fe grounds as compiled by Sherry Schick. This kind of shows all the different buildings that were associated with the New Mexico Central during its time period, that 25 to 30 year time period. Buildings within the Santa Fe Railyard associated with the New Mexico Central included a depot, a loading dock, obviously the tracks necessary for causing the trains to go up and down, as well as we found two other archaeological sites, and I'll get to those in a minute, but there was quite a bit of infrastructure associated with this. It was much smaller than the ATSF as a whole, but it was still there. And what I want to talk about today is what we see as a whole. So with the historical narrative up until this point, as I said, that it lasted for a relatively short period of time, about a quarter of a century. It moved through this period of boom or bust, in which they added on, but then they never got as far as they wanted to. They wanted to bring in other industries, but instead it got tied completely to the pinto bean, and funding fell out on it. And in the end, the ATSF just bought up all the line because they could use it for other things. In the archaeological record, we see a similar story, and that's a story I want to talk to you. Spend my time talking mostly about today. So we excavated at large numbers of sites, but the first site we excavated associated with the New Mexico Central was LA 146405, and this was the original depot. So not Tomasita's, but a depot that had existed before that time. This depot was built sometime around in August of 1903. In fact, it shows up on a 1904 map of the grounds. And in that 1904 map, it's shown as a 3-room building, as a 3-room building, which was the norm at the time. So these 3-room buildings, and I'm sorry, I am looking at my notes a little bit here, included a area for people, an area for luggage, an area for administration, an area for people, and an area for freight within it. So you'd house these 3 rooms separately. It was kind of a standard norm of the day. However, when we excavated this structure, and it's going to be really hard to see on these pictures, each of the rooms appears to have been built abutting the one before it. So unlike a structure that is normally built, where you lay down a foundation, you get your forms in place, you lay down the foundation, you pour the foundation, then you build on top of that. What it looks like they did in this case of the station is they laid out a foundation for a room, they poured the foundation for that room, they built that room, or they built the building. Then it looks like maybe a little more money came in, and they dug another foundation and built another building, which they then just attached to that building, and then so on and so forth till you get 3 buildings. Then, after all the buildings were built, they dug below the building and installed a basement with a brick floor. Now, if that sounds strange, now ideally you would do that in different. You dig the basement first, then you'd get your foundations in place, and you'd build the structure afterwards. The exact opposite's true here. In fact, this building, which is done without the use of reinforced rebar, it's just poured concrete, was done very, very sloppily. In fact, you can see, and in fact, you can see it on the north pit, the top left picture. You see this as structure 1.3, the third structure. We call it one structure, but it's really 3 different structures put onto each other. So you can see how these are going. And then the basement was given its own structure as well. Even though they're all parts of the same building, you can actually see how the concrete abuts one on the other, and that even the level of the pour is different on each of the rooms. There's actually no standardization across it. But interestingly, all of this construction appears to have happened between August of 1903 and when the map was drawn in 1904. In fact, in 1904, it shows the building as a whole here, which suggests even though it was built kind of sporadically, it was built very quickly too. So all of this was done in rapid succession. In fact, perhaps the most interesting thing associated with this structure per se is the fact that when we see later maps of this structure, when it's no longer used as a station house and they've all moved to Tomasitos, it's listed as perishables. And it looks like all the beans that were being brought in on this railroad were being stored in this one particular building. Later into the 1930s and 1940s, when the bean production disappeared with the ATSF, this actually became the distributing center for quality imports, which was the Maloof families. The Maloof was a famous Middle Eastern family in Santa Fe at the time. It's where they distributed their Coors beer and liquor. So this was the Coors beer and liquor distribution center for Santa Fe in the 1930s and 1940s. We could probably get into a separate discussion of why an Islamic family was the head of alcohol distribution in Santa Fe in the 1930s and 1940s, but that's perhaps a story that I am not able to provide you the best information on. Though I did write a little bit about it in the report, and I should probably note that here. Everything I say today, if you're really interested in the details, there's a lovely article that came out in the Artifact out of El Paso years ago, but there are also two major big reports written by myself, Jessica Badner, Chris Wenker, discussing the archaeological findings of these sites in great detail. But it's interesting to note that the Maloofs, which were of Lebanese origin, I'm seeing that on my notes here, were the primary distributors of liquor in Santa Fe during the early to middle 20th century. Okay, so I said they also had a loading dock. This is the loading dock. Well, I should say this is the loading dock at different times in the past. So the loading dock from the New Mexico Central Railway is actually structure 1. The kind of concrete and metal pilasters that you see as part of structures 2 and 3 on the right-hand side were actually built later by the ATSF. But this loading dock in warehouse structure is actually 2 superimposed loading docks. In fact, you can actually look on the structure on the left. You have not only the loading dock, but if you'll notice, there's there looks like there's a wood feature like loading on for the railroad tracks on the left-hand side. That's exactly what that is. The New Mexico Central loading dock consisted of a central wooden frame, which you can kind of see there, surrounded by an assortment of evenly spaced, flat-lying creosote planks. So planks were set out on places, and then above those would have been beams, right? The planks are at the bottom. Interestingly enough, this also shows a lack of standardization and a lack of construction ingenuity. In fact, how many planks were used for each pylon just depended. And it depended. What did it depend on? We have no idea. They varied by their size and dimensions, but also by the number of planks listed. And we believe this actually represents making best of the materials at hand at the very least. It's not a quick construction. I mean, it's a quick and dirty construction, but you can see the later structure there as well with the more formal concrete pylons that were built in by the ATSF later on. We also had the Stockyard, which I don't have a picture of, but I do have this design image. Oh, this is the loading dock as well, still here. You can see if I have a picture. I'm going to go one forward. I'm going to see if I picture the Stockyard before I do. Okay, so let me show you this picture of the loading dock first. Sometimes it's amazing how we can get things together. This actually shows better than maybe the pictures do as well. So you can see the initial structure, structure one, that's kind of to the south, and then later on, um, you can actually see the how these relate to how the original structure, the loading dock, related to a proposed ride of the New Mexico Central um, siding tracks, probably where they pulled the trucks up to load in. Um, there's also the much larger track further north, but you can see what those kind of structures look like next to each other. They're pretty ramshackle, but you can see even in the upper one, structure 3, where you have those even posts. It kind of shows you the formality in which the ATSF built things, if not the New Mexico Central. Those are very standardized, and you can see nice clear lines on each of those pylons as where they're located at. Okay, we have the stockyard and platform here in the next couple or next image. Also, you can see it's actually one of my favorite pictures to show people. How do you know where the tracks were, right? Because all the tracks are gone. How do you know? Well, that's a good. So what you see there on the right hand side is a scraping unit, where archaeologists have taken a backhoe and they've scraped away the first couple. In this case, I think it was about a foot of soil off the top. And what happens in a railroad is that when they pull all those rails, which they did, they pulled all the rails and they pulled all the wood underneath them. The coal clinkers kind of fall into those holes. So what you see there is not the deterioration of the wood, because those are creosote. They don't do it, but the clinkers and things that fell into those holes and those depressions when they pulled the railroad ties out. Just kind of cool. You can see where they're going. In fact, that's the New Mexico Central line there. The stockyard covered a rectangular area measuring about 140 feet, northeast by southwest by 280 feet, northwest by southeast. You can see that here. It's our dimensions are slightly off from those, but that's what we found. The mound that you see there, platform, appears to be a loading platform, which was located in the southeast third of the stockyard. So the stockyard would have been that whole property potentially, and with that platform being just like an earthen ramp that allowed you to drive cattle and other animals up onto the train with very little. It's literally just a pile of earth. It measured 45 meters long by 8.5 meters wide. And was about 3 feet in height, which is about the elevation you need to get them onto the train per se. The whole area was fenced off. We can see that we did not find all of the fence holes. We didn't find all the post holes, but we found enough of them to know where the stockyard was located based upon the post holes. And while it doesn't show necessarily, we have no evidence necessarily of expedience in this case. We can really see the use of natural materials, alternative materials. This was very common to use packed earth ramps to get livestock up, but in this case, everything was packed earth. There was a retaining wall built on the side that faced the track, so I don't want you to think they just mounted up the earth and then it just kind of eventually eroded down to the railroad tracks. They did have some railroad ties that kind of blocked the edge of the earthen pile so that it didn't kind of crash into the tracks if it got muddy. We can also see the other thing, of course, we recorded a lot of, which you can obviously see bits and pieces of in this this image here, was all the different railroad tracks. In fact, we had 3 archaeological sites tied specifically to the tracks themselves. So the different, both the main line as well as the various sidings or alternative lines where you could pull a train into to load it or to move it off the main tracks to make way for another train. One of the more important things we recorded as part of this doing the railroad tracks was some of the culverts that actually they were still in place, buried underneath the earth. And of course, this is one of those culverts here. This is the culvert under the number 21 line. Ideally, they gave them an order, but I don't remember there being a number 1 or a number 2 or a number 3. Most of the number lines were actually higher numbers. In fact, most of them were in the 20s. And I don't know if that means that it was in the 1920s when they installed them or what, but mostly, other than for the main line, the sightings were that we found were the 21, 28, and 29 in this general area. Other ones could have been down. The other numbers could have been down in Estancia or something like that. I'm not entirely sure, but you can see this culvert here. What's interesting about this culvert is it's actually manufactured with square nails. Now, square nails are common. They were common in the 19th century, so they were common in the 1800s. By the time the 1900s was going, and in fact, most archaeologists put the cutoff between square cut nails and wire nails, where wire nails really take off and square cut nails really go down, decline in use, is the 1890s, right? So the technology built for this culvert, which was probably built in we believe was installed at this location probably around 1910, maybe even 1915. The materials used to build this culvert were about 25 years out of date when it was built. That would be like, building with materials from the 90s today, right? Maybe even a little longer than that, building materials from the 80s. It looks a little weird to have it built in. And our expectation is either they were using old materials they could get for cheap, or possibly more likely they scavenged these materials from earlier culverts that had gone over the Acequia Madre and so on. So these are either materials scrounged up from someplace else, or the materials they could get very, very cheap because they were so out of date. There were a couple features other than for the actual rail yard itself that were also associated with the New Mexico Central, and most of those were water diversion or flood control features. Strangely, or perhaps not strangely enough, the entire area of the New Mexico Central Rail Yard and the ATSF had been agricultural fields. The whole area south of the Santa Fe River had largely been, you had the Barrio de Analco, but anything south of the Barrio de Analco in this railroad area had been fields up until really recently. In fact, it was dotted across by lots and lots of acequias, right? They fed the fields with water. The problem with acequias is once you stop, these acequias were meant to hold water and then distribute it across the fields. They're great flood control mechanisms, right? The problem is if you bring this area under industrialized use, you have the problem that these acequias, every once in a while, you'll get a good heavy rainstorm, and these acequias will redistribute all this water into your rail yard complex, which is really bad. So what it appears the New Mexico Central did in a couple places is dig, in essence, retaining ponds or diversionary channels. And we can see one of these here where it's literally, you can see the Acequia Madre, the very lower portion of your screen. You can see the Acequia Madre, how it's coming off. It's pretty much where the Cerrillos Road was, and it's diverting off, and they've got to keep it from flooding over the tracks. So they build this huge, in essence, ditch just next to the tracks that water can flood into if it has to. And you get this kind of retaining pond at the very far end. So the idea is so that the culverts don't blow. So that culvert that we just looked at, right? We just looked at the culvert that went over this area for the Acequia Madre to protect the railroad tracks. They needed that not to get overwhelmed and blown out in a flood. So they created this retention pond, water retention area as possibly a part of it. So we had these features as well. All of these, if you look at the up at the top, you'll notice I have a stratigraphic profile of the ditch itself. It's very uneven. It appears to be hand dug. It's large. Don't get me wrong. It's very large, but it is not a it once again kind of goes over perhaps not the best planning per se. for how to build something. And it's unclear how many times that culvert had washed out before they even built this retention thing, which makes it even stranger when you think that the culvert was built with materials that were 25 years out of date. It's possible that it even goes back further than that, like that not further back, that it's even more recent. That culvert was possibly done in the 1920s, the last time it was built, making those materials 35 years old, 30 years old at the time that that structure was built. So that's pretty telling about what it is. But more telling than that was what we found in association with the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe rail yard. So both these industries, so both the ATSF, which was another, in fact, you had Ken here who talked about the ATSF in Albuquerque. The ATSF was a very big commercial enterprise across the United States, and they built on an impressive scale. And so you can see to the left, you have these small structures and ephemeral structures associated with the New Mexico Central compared to the robust infrastructure that was built for the ATSF in Santa Fe at the same time. In fact, I use if you look the first New Mexico Central photo, remember that's that building they built and then decided to add a basement to it after they'd already built it. What you see here on the right-hand side with the ATSF is you see two engine repair bays. So the outside walls of the structure, you can barely see the foundations for the outside. These are all sandstone or limestone too. And I forget in this case which one they are. The one below is definitely limestone, but I think the one in the top photo of the ATSF is sandstone. But these bays, not only did they build these subterranean features into these engineering workshops so that you could get underneath the trains and work on them, but they were perfectly stone lined. They were built to hold thousands of tons of pounds of weight on top of them. It's very, very impressive. Conversely, we can see the ephemeral posts, and I'm not looking at the cement post there, but the kind of the wood plank posts that were added by the New Mexico Central Railway, where they decided on a whim how many of those planks they were going to put in for the joists. Whereas we can see the uniform shape and consistency of the cut limestone used for the water tower that the ATSF built during the same time period, or a couple, actually, I take that back, a decade or two earlier for the New Mexico rail yard. I'm going to read a little here because I want to get my points across correctly, and I apologize, but I think this is worth saying. Features associated with both the New Mexico Central and ATSF railways were encountered within the Santa Fe Rail Yard project. On a general level, the two railways shared a lot in common. Both railways were standard gauge railroads. Both owned a depot, storage facilities, and track. Both operated in Santa Fe during the early 20th century. However, these railways represent very different businesses. The New Mexico Central was a local, or at best a regional enterprise, funded and owned by New Mexico businessmen. Resources, as is shown through the archaeological record and through the archival research, were derived from shipping agricultural products, particularly pinto beans, across southern Colorado, New Mexico, and West Texas. Budget shortfalls were common. These shortfalls constrained the construction of additional lines, limiting the number of markets accessible to the railway. To the New Mexico Central, Santa Fe was a large and important market for goods originating in the Estancia Basin. Through the New Mexico Central Railway's agreement with the Denver Rio Grande Northern, that's the Bean Line, it also served as a gateway to markets north. Facilities constructed within Santa Fe largely followed the local vernacular construction techniques using concrete without rebar reinforcement, with additional rooms built on as necessary or as funds became available. Several of the features, such as the culvert at LA 149911, appear to have used out-of-date materials, possibly as a cost-saving measure. Conversely, the ATSF was a national enterprise, funded by businessmen throughout the country. The ATSF shipped everything. but was supported in large part by manufacturing industries in the Midwest, particularly Chicago and St. Louis, which saw the West as a growing market for their factory-produced items. Funds were not an issue. Expansion throughout the West was both rapid and thorough. Santa Fe was not an important market to the ATSF. It did not boast a sizable population when compared to Los Angeles, San Francisco, Sacramento, Denver, and Salt Lake City. In designing the New Mexico portion of the ATSF main line, engineers saw fit to bypass Santa Fe altogether, choosing instead to create a spur to Santa Fe at the Lamy Junction, only after local businessmen raised funds to pay for the project. Ultimately, Santa Fe represented the last stop on a line of secondary importance. However, in building the ATSF rail yard in Santa Fe, the railway had the means to acquire and transport manufacturing products from materials produced throughout the country. Instead of constructing their buildings with the materials at hand, ATSF chose to import quarried sandstone. It chose to employ standard construction hardware instead of using outdated materials like the New Mexico Central. It built on a scale necessary to meet its needs. While this may not have been on the size of the rail yard in Chicago, the ATSF infrastructure in Santa Fe was much more grandiose than the ephemeral undertakings of the New Mexico Central. Within the archaeological record, structures associated with the ATSF were almost always larger, built of more robust materials, and built on a much larger scale than their competitors. Following trends towards an ever-increasing nationalized business structure, the financial power of the ATSF eventually caused the struggling New Mexico Central to collapse completely in the 1920s. The ATSF assumed ownership of the New Mexico Central line and all associated infrastructure. New Mexico Central functions were consolidated with the ATSF, which survives today as the Burlington Northern and Santa Fe, or BNSF. And that is, in essence, I think I'm actually good for time today. That is, in essence, my presentation here today on the New Mexico Central, was to give you a broad idea as to what this thing was in Santa Fe, why it was important to the state, and why it actually perhaps didn't do as well. There's the railroad crew yourself. This is not what the Santa Fe rail yard area looks like today, but when it was full of hobos and drug users, archaeologists felt right at home there, including myself. And that was our crew from the time period. In fact, many of you have met Jessica Badner. She's on the far left. You can see her there. I'm actually on the, not the far right, but I'm the second to the right underneath Isaac Herrera. But any rate, this was a passion project for me because of my own history of living in the Estancia Valley. I knew quite a bit about agricultural production in the Estancia Valley, but learning about the New Mexico Central was really new to me at the time. And I really enjoyed every aspect of the project, which hopefully I've imparted some knowledge on today. And I apologize that I wasn't able to get my notes displaying. I didn't want to just present my notes on I couldn't get my notes to display on this PowerPoint today. So I apologize for that I was probably a bit more scattered than I am usually, but I will open it up for questions. And as always, you can always shoot me an email if you don't want to ask questions.
That little stick that is black and white, is that representing a foot, 2 or 3 foot?
Those are actually the black and white on all those are meter sticks. So what you're seeing there, or some of them are 30 centimeter sticks, depending on which ones you see. Every white section or every black section is 10 centimeters.
Hello. Can you translate that into foot and inches for me?
Yeah, that's fine. It's interesting. I'll tell you, one of the challenges of this project is archaeologists traditionally train in using centimeters, and everything done in 19th and 20th century New Mexico is done in inches. So we record things in centimeters, but then I have to go back and transfer them into inches to make it work. So what is 10 centimeters in terms of inches? Well, it doesn't come out perfectly, but if you want to ballpark, I think it's 3 inches equal close to 10 centimeters.
Did the New Mexico Central and the Santa Fe also share a depot at Kennedy where the lines intersected?
They may have. I don't know off the top of my head on where they shared a depot in. Well, so let's be clear. The Santa Fe Central is the New Mexico Central Railway.
Right.
So at early on in its life, and I want to make sure I'm saying this correctly so that I'm not saying it wrong. The New Mexico Central Railway was originally called the Santa Fe Central up until 1908. So the Santa Fe Central in Kennedy was the New Mexico Central. So they didn't share a building. They were actually the same organization. I use the New Mexico Central, which was the later name for the Railyard. So it was known as the Santa Fe Central up until 1908 officially. It
Okay.
became the New Mexico Central after it actually incorporated the Albuquerque Eastern Railway. As why the Albuquerque Eastern Railway never reached Albuquerque, that's a different matter. But at the time, it was a portion of it. So the Santa Fe Central was the New Mexico Central Railway.
Okay, one other question. Do you have any idea, as the line proceeds north from Estancia, Moriarty into Santa Fe, if the grade also increases?
You mean the
The elevation of the
line?
It
would have to. I didn't do any research on that myself. It would have to, at least a little bit, because of elevation difference between the basin and Santa Fe itself.
Okay.
But I don't know if anybody's done any studies on that. Years ago, when I first, or shortly after I gave this presentation for the first time, John Hayden had been doing some work out by Frost Road, which is out by Edgewood. And he'd been looking at the spur that was supposed to go out to Hagen and had been walking that. But I don't know of anybody who's done any work on the line that went up to Santa Fe per se. I'm not sure how much of it you can walk. I assume you can get on portions of it today, and it would have to if gone up in elevation to get into Santa Fe.
Okay.
There's just no way. I mean, geologically, I don't think it's possible for them to have done it any other way. But it doesn't have the, I'm just thinking off, and I'm thinking off the top of my head here. They don't have the beauty of the New Mexico Central is it doesn't have the hurdle that, like, for example, the Rail Runner has today, right? The Rail Runner has to go up, it goes off to the side, but it pretty much still has to get up La Bajada. You don't have that. You have a raise in elevation, but you don't have between Santa Fe and Estancia, you don't have that geologic. There's no big. That you're going through the Galisteo and then into the Estancia Valley. You don't really have any large geologic features you have to overcome.
Okay. Is any of that New Mexico Central alignment slated to become a rail trail, pedestrian, bicycle trail?
Not to my knowledge.
Okay.
I think it would be wonderful if it did, because I think, like anything else, first of all, I want to be clear. One of the things I learned about this project is that there are a lot of people passionate about railroads, much more passionate than necessarily I am. But though I love industrial archaeology, my interest was primarily in how important this train was at making sure people in Moriarty had jobs. In fact, according to several of the accounts, people actually, went from Moriarty and attended school in Santa Fe during that time period because of the train operating. You could actually attend school in Santa Fe, which I thought was a very novel concept. I would love to see, I would love to see something like that move forward, but I don't know of any attempt at any of that stuff. I also don't know, and this sounds horrible considering I've been to Estancia many times. There are many buildings associated with New Mexico Central in Estancia, but I don't know if any of them have. I can't think of one that's been preserved or interpreted in Estancia. Now, the buildings I just showed you, the foundations, they're all gone. Everything I just showed you is gone. And that's because of the construction and development that happened at the rail yard and for the rail runner and for the commercial developments around the Santa Fe rail yard. So I want to be clear, the things I just showed you, you can't preserve. But there are plenty of materials associated with the New Mexico Central still located throughout the state. Not so much in Moriarty, but definitely in Estancia itself. If you are interested in hardcore, in the data of inches and feet and how big some of these things are, please do go to the reports. El Paso Archaeological Society has a great article by me in one of their volumes, I think from 2012, maybe, that you could look it up on their website, or the Office of Archaeological Studies has the Santa Fe Railyard project reports available free for download. They're really big, but they include both work by myself on the New Mexico Central, as well as work on the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railyard that was primarily conducted by my colleague, Jessica Badner, who's now at Historic Preservation Division. Both of us worked under Chris Wanker at the time. I also, if you love the Outhouses and Matt's stories of human poop, I dug 3 really great outhouses associated with the ATSF out there that are just chock full of goodies. They're not related to this because they're not New Mexico Central, but there's a lot of other good stuff out there.
Okay, thank you very much.
There's a question, how many Native American sites were found during the surveys and what time periods did they represent?
Okay. In the New Mexico Central Railway, Railyard area, I don't remember finding any Native American sites, but I want to be clear that this wasn't really surveying. So by the time with industrial archaeology in an urban site like this, even with the Capitol Complex historic neighborhood, one of the ways we were testing a lot of these archaeological sites early on was putting in backhoe trenches. So you couldn't tell from the surface a lot of times there was anything there. So what you did, in fact, I hope some of those images actually, they actually show them. I didn't really talk about them. You'll see SCUs and backhoe, BHT over and over again. What those represent is backhoe trenches and scraping units. And those represent areas where archaeologists use mechanical, pretty much a backhoe, to scrape down areas to look for archaeological remains. There was very little even of colonial time period in the Railyard area. Most of Santa Fe's settlement ended at the Barrio de Analco up until the 19th century. There was some Spanish colonial pits that were excavated there. In fact, I think my colleague Jessica Badner wrote those up, so I'm not as detailed about those, but I do not remember any Native American sites on that project. Now, we did do a project. I just said, south of the river, there's not that much. So if you were to draw a line from where we did the Railyard project to the 2 blocks over where I did, or 2 or 3 blocks over where I did the Capitol Complex Historic Neighborhood project, between those 2 areas, so a block and a half east of the Railyard and a block and a half west of the Capitol Complex, we did the Judicial Complex project. That project was done for the new county courthouse, which is kind of over by the Baton building nowadays. That project, interestingly enough, while we started working on 20th century archaeology, in fact, I did the maternal health center there, and I wrote quite a bit on the maternal health center. There was a early classic period or late coalition period pit house right underneath that. So I want to be clear, especially when you're using backhoes and you cannot do pedestrian surveys because the ground's been so disturbed and you just don't have a modern, a good footprint. It's not like going out into the forest and surveying today. Doesn't mean there are not Native American sites there. Just means they went undetected during the research potentially. In case of that pit house, it's probably tied into the larger community, which was north of the river, just like south of the river had been the kind of the boonies or agricultural center for a lot of Santa Fe residents during the colonial period. That might have just represented a family living out there next to their fields while the bigger village was north of the river. It's contemporaneous. So it's important to note that these places are connected and they're part of a larger landscape. It's interesting to think Santa Fe, the city, even in prehistoric times, expanded south of the river, in a kind of a strange fashion. But there were not a lot of Native. I don't remember any Native American sites, but I'll be honest. My background, and I know today most people think, well, Matt's a champion for Native American archaeology, and he does early contact period archaeology. I do, and I did even early on in my career. But I was brought onto those projects primarily for my knowledge of 19th and 20th century history. And so my focus on those projects to support other archaeologists. In fact, that Judicial Complex one, the actual work on the prehistoric pit house was done by Stephen Lakatos, who's now want to say, I don't know what I'm not going to remember what his proper title is right off the top of my head, but he's a cultural resource manager for the Department of Transportation. And he's done a lot of work on indigenous populations, movements prehistorically, and he's the one who focused on that, not me necessarily. So you're getting a very skewed lens. And the reason I have not, I unfortunately, it would be too broad of a topic to talk about all 30 of those archaeological sites in a presentation here. Instead, I just try to focus on the New Mexico Central, which is the portion I wrote up.
Matt, can you say again when the New Mexico Central line was abandoned and torn up?
So it's going to depend. Technically, the New Mexico Central ceases to exist in 1926. However, there's a big however, the ATSF took it over primarily to use those lines. So those lines continued in use. And in fact, in some cases, they built their own structures. They just bought the land. Here, it's like buying bear in mind, this is probably horrible. You know how sometimes people buy stuff not because the buildings on the land are any good, but the land's worth more than the houses, but they can just, this happens a lot in the Northeast or even in wealthy areas of New Mexico, right? They buy the old slum house and then they build something nicer in its place because the land's more valuable than what's on there. That's what the ATSF was doing. They consolidated all those properties, but the lines themselves, here's the caveat. The New Mexico Central lines were standard gauge, which means that if they maintained the line, they could continue to use it. So while they didn't use most of the buildings, it appears, I believe that in most cases, they continued to use the sidings and some of the lines going forward. In fact, the industry, the train still ran for a bit time. It just wasn't managed as a local business.
And so I assume it was not tied to the Santa Fe Railway where they crossed. It only met the Santa Fe and Santa Fe. In other words, the two railroads crossed, the Santa Fe main line and
the ATSF. Okay, ATSF. Right. All right. I'm just trying to. There's a lot. So we're not talking about the Santa Fe Central. We're talking about the ATSF. They did not connect anywhere. To my knowledge, they didn't connect anywhere else. But the reality is those sidings could have been used very easily. You wouldn't have had to put a lot of effort into drawing some line that would connect your lines with their sidings. So I don't think that was an issue. And in fact, I think David Snow says as much in the report when he looks at the cultural use of the area. But the ATSF was not interested in Podunk, New Mexico's agricultural production.
Right.
And it also, it's important to note that, at the time period which this is dying, you're also starting to see the birth of roads, more roads. So it's not just associated with the ATSF being the bad guys, but there's other factors at play.
And did you know that the depot at Kennedy is now part of the community center complex here in El Dorado?
Oh, really?
Yeah, it was moved up, and it's basically used as a meeting room.
That's cool. No, I did not know that.
Yeah.
So, question: does ATSF coming board really kill the agricultural production in Estancia, or was it World War II?
No. Well, there's a lot. So we can get into a whole nother history about why agricultural production. It's important to note the ATSF existed before the New Mexico Central and after the New Mexico Central. So they were always there. They came in early with lots of money and they stayed a long, long time. Now, what killed bean production in Estancia? There's a number of things. First of all, environmental factors. Any of you might go out to Estancia today and look at the nature of the land out there. It's kind of a dry, very, very dry grassland. In fact, it's an old lake bed, right? It's an old giant lake bed. It's not ideal for agricultural production in the least bit. And the reality is What you're also seeing is a whole, and I kind of mentioned, actually, this will lead into the Capitol Complex historic neighborhood in a different way. I said in the 20th century, cattle production starts to replace sheep and goat. Well, here's a very, very big difference in how people handled. So traditionally, New Mexico sheep and goat herding was done in the highlands. So you got people from Taos, and they'd bring their sheep and flocks into the forest. There were less production on the flats than there was. There was some. Don't get me wrong, but cattle country. Now that makes sense for the Estancia Basin, and so what you see, of course, is a transition towards cattle. But that's not necessarily tied to the death of the railroad, but rather it was probably, if I'm honest, I don't think the railroad was ever very profitable. I think it was New Mexico residents trying to do something great for their communities and trying to make themselves very good. And Estancia for a little while was having a boom in pinto bean production, and they were capitalizing on that. But even still, when we look at the New Mexico Central Railway and the history of it, the want to get coal from Hagen, the want to export salt from the Salt Lakes, these sound like really good ideas, right? Until you realize the history of Hagen, right? It's boom or bust, right? It doesn't last very long. And the fact that the Estancia Salt Lakes were going to be a mecca for salt production is unrealistic, to say the least. So these were very not very well realized ventures for New Mexico residents. It was their hope to do these things, but unfortunately, many of these things, even coal mining in New Mexico, is a large corporate production. In fact, Hagen never got as big as the mining camps in northeastern New Mexico, and for good reason. Those were company towns, or in southeastern Colorado, which are probably the ones you're more familiar with as in the popular imagination of, like, Ludlow, for example. It just wasn't going to work, and unfortunately, they were, for the ATSF, they were taking up space that could be better utilized. So what you see is in essence, what you're looking at here in this story is the mom and pop grocery store competing with Walmart or Albertsons. You know, if they're right next to each other, the Walmart's going to win. They offer more. They can afford to take a loss. They don't have to have a good year. They don't have to have even a good decade. They're fine. They can be doing terrible in New Mexico and be fine and be making tons of money in California, to where it doesn't even matter. They just run the New Mexico stores as a thing. The people at the New Mexico Central were completely dependent upon New Mexico's economy. And those things were changing. We are seeing radical and dramatic changes. While it closes before the Great Depression, we can obviously see some of those same factors playing in. That's at least my perspective on it. I am not an economic major necessarily in this case, but I can tell you from an archaeological standpoint, it never looks like they had much money. It looks like things were built by locals with materials at hand, or materials they could scavenge, or whatever they could get their hands on. It does not look like a play, and it's in such stark contrast to the ATSF. The ATSF came in and said, we build it this way, and they built it that way. The New Mexico Central came in and said, we can afford one room. A month later, they said, let's add a second room. Hey, guys, we got more money. We get a third room. Now it looks like a real station. You know what we should add next? A basement. Just go ahead and pull up those floorboards. Dig yourself a basement. Oh, wait, this isn't big enough. Let's move over. Let's join with these other local guys and see if we can build a station at Tomasitas. All right, cool. Well, what was going to become Tomasitas? Hey guys, let's make a loading dock. All right, what are we going to do? Well, we'll need wood for the joists. Well, I got a couple of these planks. My buddy knows a guy with these planks. Well, how many of these planks do you need? Well, it depends, what we're doing with this specific spot. We might be able to get away with one plank here. All right, let's get away with one plank here. Well, you can't get away with two here. You can't get away with one here. You're holding up the major portion of the structure. Okay, put two planks here. That's the way things work for the New Mexico Central. That's probably the best way to explain it.
Hey, Matt,
Sounds like a lot of small businesses in New
Yeah,
Mexico
exactly.
today.
Absolutely. It's the small business versus the mega corporation.
hey, Matt, this is Gretchen Openoff, and I want to answer Steve Rospopo's question about why they stopped farming.
Okay.
My grandparents homesteaded separately and met out in the Estancia Basin. And what I always heard was it was much wetter in the early part of the 20th century.
That's probably
And
true.
they were dry farming beans out there. Pinto bean capital of the world,
Yeah.
which is now southern Colorado. And they were, after about, I don't know, 1920, a little earlier, you can't dry farm beans. The only thing you can dry farm out there anymore is cows.
Yeah.
So climate change.
Yeah.
Or at least the weather changed.
And we'd probably be reminisce, since we're talking about Moriarty and the Estancia Basin, be remiss that if you do want to go out there and experience agriculture nowadays, probably the most famous thing out there, other than the fact that lots of people have cattle, is McCall's Pumpkin Patch, which holds an amazing, not to do a promo for my hometown, which amazing, pre-COVID times. I don't think they did it this year. An amazing corn maze and pumpkin. You can get your pumpkin there, and they have activities for all the kids, and it's amazing time. That wasn't going when I was a kid, but it's a big thing out there today. It's a big to-do.
If you
Don't they also
fly,
have pumpkin chunkin where they shoot pumpkins out of homemade cannon?
I don't know if they have that, but they do have like a haunted house thing.
I know some places do. I thought they did that.
if you fly over the Estancia Basin, they're pumping groundwater for agriculture now.
Yeah.
Nobody's dry farming anything.
All right. Well, you guys have been a wonderful audience today. Thank you very much. Thank you for having me. As I said, next time we'll be back and we're going to be talking about modern warfare, and we will be going back into my PowerPoint presentations that are for more recent years rather than 15 years ago. But have a nice evening, guys.
Thank you, Matt.
Happy New Year, Matt.
Happy New
Happy
Year.
New Year, everyone.